we will jump right in. So welcome back to the workshops. This is the final workshop. This is the titled my concluding thoughts. Pretty much to try to look to sort of summarize and draw some conclusions on what we can gain through examining the 12 steps as a myth through this unique perspective that Carl Jung has provided. I mean, and we've covered a lot of ground over the last 20 some odd weeks. You know, we've taken our own plunge into the dark, I guess you could say, and of course that's why I have this image of water here, right? Water always sort of represents the unconscious or the collective unconscious, that part of ourselves that we can't really see too clearly. So, and as I started out, I wanted to, I'm surprised I never read this until now, but I wanted to include this, this little snippet from Joseph Campbell, that really kind of gets to the heart of the process that we've been talking about. You know, this passage was in the book till almost to the very end. And then it finally didn't make the cut, but this is what it says. I just love this from Campbell. He says, there's a passage in the old French Quest del Saint Graal, that's the Arthurian romances, that epitomizes the true spirit of Western man. It tells of a day when the knights of Arthur's court gathered in the banquet hall waiting for dinner to be served. It was a custom of the court that no meal should be served until an adventure had come to pass. Adventures came to pass in those days frequently, so there was no danger of Arthur's people going hungry. On the present occasion, the Grail appeared, covered with a samite cloth, hung in the air a moment, and withdrew. Everyone was exalted, and Gawain, the nephew of King Arthur, rose and suggested a vow. I propose, he said, that we all now set forth in quest to behold that Grail unveiled. And so it was that they agreed. There then comes a line that, when I read it, Joseph Campbell speaking, burned itself into my mind. They thought it would be a disgrace to go forth in a group. Each entered the forest at the point that he himself had chosen, where it was darkest and where there was no way or path. And, you know, the interesting thing about this little myth is that the symbol is also a symbol of or the forest is also a symbol of the unconscious. You know, another place where spiritual adventures happen. And the thing that we've sort of the underlying message, right, of this whole sort of series of presentations and of my book is that we don't achieve enlightenment by imagining figures of light, to quote Jung again, but we do so by making the darkness conscious. And so it's by entering into the unconscious, right, that taking that spiritual journey that is really going to provide us the most growth and the most kind of fruitful existence, I guess, that we can imagine. Campbell, he speaks of the kind of adventure that epitomizes Western man, right? That each person goes into the forest in their own individual way where it was darkest. And what I've tried to show throughout these workshops is that we have adopted a truly Western system in the 12 steps. You know, Bill Wilson himself was about as prototypically Western as a human being can be. I mean, his name is Bill Wilson, you know, like he might as well have been a cowboy, right? Or something. I mean, it's just everything about Wilson was Western to the utmost. And he adopted this Western, this, you know, we've seen that it comes from William James and from there back to other poets. And then that there was even some American Indian influence that came into the 12 steps. And so we've really sort of, we really are carrying the torch forward, I guess, in terms of this great Western tradition. And the point that I try to make here in this final chapter, this concluding chapter, is that what we've been examining to a large degree up until now is really Bill Wilson's kind of own personal psychology, right? That certainly is kind of the basis of our examination. Now, my psychology plays into the book a little as well, but I think even more so, we've been trying to look at Wilson's psychology. What we have in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous is really a projection of Wilson's own psychology. And really what he presents there is kind of the saga of his own individuation as he understood it. And this is very similar to the way the alchemists projected their own psychology into the chemicals and the materials that they were experimenting with, right? As we know from personal experience, we humans have an invincible dread of becoming more self-aware, more self-conscious. And what we have in the big book, which I don't think we could praise Bill Wilson enough in this regard. But what we have in the big book is a demonstration of really the fundamental nature of the human psyche, right? That which includes all of its shortcomings, as well as sort of the nature of its redemption, right? What Wilson calls a restoration to sanity. And Wilson makes it really clear in the big book that human beings, all of us, suffer from what I've called a delusion of control. And that what's very interesting I find about the big book is that the more I learn about psychology and different schools of psychology, is that to this day, 90 years later, people, academics and scientists are still they're still wrestling with the same concepts that Wilson put forth in the big book when it comes to not only recovery, but just psychological transformation in general. IFS is a perfect example of this. That Wilson clearly speaks of parts in the big book. And Richard Schwartz was able to sort of also kind of back into this same perspective through his own practice and his own experience. And I don't know that Bill Wilson was fully conscious of what he was writing. But what is clear is that he was intricately aware of the workings of his own psyche. And that allowed him to postulate many things that are now being confirmed by the psychologists, right? Indeed, and what's fascinating is that Wilson was postulating these same concepts as a contemporary with Carl Jung from the same sort of psycho-spiritual perspective. And I don't know that the full sort of impact or the implications of that statement have really become super clear yet. But hopefully one of the sort of the impetuses for me writing this book, the way I wrote the book in the language that I used to write the book, was to try to help the world come to a recognition of this fact, right? That Bill Wilson had his finger on the pulse of the human psyche almost as much as Carl Jung himself. So what Wilson helps to uncover for scores of alcoholics and drug addicts, as well as their families, and basically anybody that suffers from any kind of behavioral or mental illness, is that in the psyche, there are such things as autonomous complexes, right? Autonomous complexes, and that these complexes drive us towards a situation or an ego state that he described as incomprehensible demoralization. And now this is maybe a stretch, but I would say that it's almost impossible for just a regular old guy, no less an alcoholic, to come up with this concept on his own. Wilson didn't have the help of a therapist. He didn't have the help of a great AA sponsor, right? He was really just alone in the world, sort of reluctantly writing this book. And yet he was able to intuit that these complexes exist within us and that they arise out of a spiritual malady. And this is a really profound, I mean, right? Meaning the professional community gives Carl Jung all the credit in the world for his wonderful prescription to Roland Hazard that he needed to have a vital spiritual experience. that flew in the face of everything that psychology was standing for at the time. And yet over here in America, we have this sober drunk, right? That's coming up with this same process, laying out this sort of this spiritual curriculum on how one can deal with those autonomous psychic complexes. Interestingly, the program that Bill introduces in the steps is one that walks this sort of blurry line between psychology and religion. And we talked about this early on, right? That William James's phrase, the psychology of religious experience, and how that was such a moving concept for Carl Jung that it literally kind of ignited his own spiritual quest. That's exactly what Wilson's exploring in the Big Book. And the early parts of this chapter, I have this statement in there from Stephen Herman, which really just struck me. It says psychology and religion are complementary paths to the same goal, self-realization of the unconscious. And I would want to clarify that just a little bit, right? Because over the course of this 20 some odd weeks, we've talked a lot about religion. We've talked a lot about the shortcomings of religious organizations, right? But that overall, the concept of religion and most importantly, the symbols, right? That religion deals with psychic change just like psychology does. And what Wilson does is sort of blend the two into this really obviously very impactful and profound program that's now spread across the world. And as Dr. Herman says, it has become one of the largest organizations in the world. And that's just AA. If we include Narcotics Anonymous and some of the other fellowships, the miracles are astounding that take place within the rooms. We've talked a lot about self-realization, right? And it's nice to be able to read a quote like that from Dr. Herman, and then sort of, the group of us can sort of understand what it means now, right? After all this work we've done, right? That self-realization boils down to the self becoming conscious, right? Or that the God image is becoming human is another way to say that. And the self manifests itself into form through the means of the human ego, through each of us, right? And as our ego develops, so does our image of God, right? And that due to the archetypal nature of this process that we've been unfolding here, we can pretty much bank on the fact that what happens to us individually will also happen collectively, so that we can look at sort of the expression of the God image as it evolves in Western consciousness, and that for the most part, that's going to track right alongside our own psychic development. At least that's the case. That's been the case with me. And I sort of used that framework from which to approach the book. The transformation of the individual, the implications of this concept are interesting, because that means that the transformation of the individual is really contingent upon his or her ability to allow their conception of the divine to morph, right? In other words, we will change only as much as we allow our God image to change. And that more so that this really subtle point is that God image, the way we project that image, is a mirror of what's taking place inside of us. And that's really one of the kind of strong points that I try to make here in the conclusion. So one more thing I want to touch on here is that for the alchemists, right, that their goal was to free the God image from matter, whereas in the Christian system, the idea was that the God was going to free man from his own dark nature. And I like the twist there, because I feel like it takes us to another level, like a little bit deeper of an experience, right? When we begin to understand that actually the God image is trapped within us, we are the matter, we are the body, we are the earth, and that through our ego, the goal is that we kind of free that image and allow it to express itself. So, a statement from the shadow of a figure light says, the image of God that is slowly emerging over the course of eons is the most beautiful self-portrait we could ever imagine. And I wanted to just highlight this because it's true, right? The God, the thing we're looking for is the thing we're looking with. And that this thing, this essence is so very close to us that it's really easy to overlook. So with that in mind, I want to, we're going to kind of circle back and really kind of maybe talk about Bill Wilson's psychology just a little bit more explicitly, if you will. And this is how he projected it into his own alchemical opus, The 12 Steps. Now, what's interesting here is I don't really know anything about Bill Wilson's own personal history. I don't know about any of his trauma that he experienced as a child. I don't know about his relationship with his parents or his grandparents. I know very little. And yet, due to the archetypal nature of the process that he presents, because what happens to him happens to us, right? So the deeper we go into our own psyche, then we become more enabled to understand the psychology of other people, and to sort of, so we can look at Wilson's psychology from this archetypal strata, and it becomes pretty evident what's going on there. And that's just fascinating, right? The Jungians very often would sort of analyze the psyche of like different authors, really important authors, right? And one of the things that I try to do in my book is to kind of walk that line, but I'm not a professionally trained psychologist, so I'm not very good at it. But I wouldn't doubt if someday a depth psychologist sort of tackles Wilson's psychology in kind of the way I am now. So, and let's read this. This is from The Shadow of a Figure of Light. It says, projections of the self. We can expect the God image to continue to morph in the collective imagination so long as human consciousness continues to expand, and we continue to tell the tale of what we used to be like, what happened, and what we are like now. The essence of transformation, right? In both psychology and religion. Jung helped to usher in this new approach to the God concept when he superimposed the self, a conception he borrowed from a multitude of influences spanning the globe and history of the world, with his own notion of spirituality. However, Jung tells us that he wasn't the only person in the modern West to depict the emergence of the self. It had already begun bubbling up through the writings of other modern authors who hinted at its presence through characters in their fictional narratives, opening his mind, Jung's, further to the individualized nature of the emerging God image. However, those authors' portraits of the self had come about unconsciously, as we saw in the case of Nietzsche, whose relationship to his own shadow we touched upon in chapter 11. Jung explains in Psychological Types that, quote, in unconscious fantasies, the self often appears as a supraordinate or ideal personality, having somewhat the relationship of Faust to Goethe or Zarathustra to Nietzsche. Now, those are two of the main characters in those two authors' works, in their classic works. For the sake of idealization, the archaic features of the self are represented as being separate from the higher self, as, for instance, Mephistopheles in Goethe, Epimetheus in Spitaler, and in Christian psychology, the devil or the Antichrist. Now, we talked a lot about that in chapter 13, I think, 12, chapter 13, right? How the Christian image itself was split. There was a higher and a lower, and that the church fathers, out of probably a desire to manifest more good in the world, had actually sort of emasculated the dark figure and tried to shove it sort of under the rug, so to speak. That's a natural Western tendency, Jung says, to idealize the higher self. In Nietzsche, Zarathustra discovered his shadow in The Ugliest Man. So basically, Jung's saying that he presented the self, but then kind of like the archetype of the alcoholic, right? Once you see the archetype of the self, you see it everywhere. Same thing with the archetype of the alcoholic. So But so what Jung says is that this that the self is often shows up in fictional characters, but it does so unconscious, like it's an unconscious portrayal of the self. So Jung gives us some of the examples that he pulled from, but there's others. Uh, and not the least of which is actually the archetype of the alcoholic. That would be a portrayal of the self as well. This is my commentary on this passage. While the notion of the divine self had been contemplated in the East for millennia, Jung encountered an image of the self that could bridge the gap between the most ancient conceptions of God, what he called the primitive, with that of the modern West, one that fused the dark primordial powers of the unconscious with those of the light of modern human intellect. Here again, we see how our culture's religious myths provide a stark reflection of our individual psychology. For whenever an author, a psychologist, or a prophet splits the God image into a higher and lower aspect, either within a narrative or through a paradoxical image, it is an unconscious portrayal of the self. And I should say it is very often an unconscious portrayal of the self. Jung provides us a clue then, right here, on how we can examine Wilson's myth from the perspective of depth psychology. Because once we see that Bill was also projecting the self into his writings, then we understand that his use of phrases such as universal mind, higher power, and God as we understood him are really nothing less than projections of the self. And just like Goethe, Nietzsche, and the authors of like the Gospels, for example, Wilson himself too is idealizing the higher aspect. These unconscious portrayals are split, right? So very often, like even in sort of pop psychology, the self is held to be an image of light, right? It's always the higher self, right? While the dark half is just left in the dark. Jung tells us again, this is an attempt to idealize the higher self. And again, this is where very kind of sneakily that concept of the transformation of the God image kind of creeps back in, right? Because if when we speak of God, we're projecting an unconscious content, then the same way we see that image will be a reflection of the way we see ourselves. Now, there can be kind of, twisted renditions of this, but for the most part, our tendency to idealize the higher self really becomes a commentary on our own inability to accept the seed of our own darkness, right? In other words, we're denying the shadow. This is what I say in the book. Psychologically speaking, the shadowy half of the image that is cut off is illustrative of our inability to understand our own unconscious compulsivity. In an attempt to idealize our own higher self, we deny having any real connection to the dark and archaic urges that make up so much of the human psyche, and that is reflected in the characters of our story. And In Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, for instance, the ugliest man murdered God for having plumbed the depths of his dark side. We see the same tendency in our religious myths as well. For example, the God of the Old Testament, named Yahweh, the unyielding creature who punished Job and later Jesus, cuts off his Luciferian opponent, who is then ironically banished to outer darkness for encompassing many of the same amoral traits as the not so benevolent God figure. And just as we tend to deny the existence of our individual shadow, rather than seeking to reconcile the antithetical, paradoxical energy expressed through these mythical images, the shadow of the figure of light is cut off, mirroring our refusal to accept our own innate darkness. So to deny the darkness of the God image is to deny one's own darkness, inasmuch as the God image is a reflection of the self. And this is why the transformation of the God image is so important, because that supraordinate psychic entity that exists deep within us, the more fully we can comprehend that image, the more fully we're able to understand ourselves. The more fully we're able to accept the paradoxical nature of the unconscious, the more fully we're able to accept who we actually are here in consciousness. What is the true nature of our own personality? And we see this laid out in the 12 steps. Step 12 tells us that having had a spiritual awakening, as the result of these steps. And then step 11 tells us exactly sort of the nuts and bolts of how that happened, right? It came through improved conscious contact with God as we understood him. Here's the thing though. If we look back through those previous 10 steps, we didn't really do a lot of work sort of directly on transforming the God image, or even on sort of improving conscious contact with the God image directly. What we did was improve conscious contact with ourselves. That is the nature of the 12 steps. But when we improve conscious contact with ourselves and we get to see the great reality, capital G, capital R, about ourselves, then what happens is that sort of paves the way for us then to become more consciously connected with the God image, which is, again, a reflection of the self. Moving on. It's easy for us. So I want to say this too, because so it's easy for us, I think, to sort of point fingers at other religious and spiritual systems, right? And to feel smugly superior, as Wilson would have probably said. And so I kind of tried my best to give some feedback, or some sort of criticism, right? Some context in the last in this conclusion. Because just like Goethe, Nietzsche, and the church fathers, Wilson was also guilty of denying the shadow of the figure of light. I mean, you may argue otherwise, but let me try to make my case here. And the point is too that it's not just Wilson that does this, right? We're all guilty of this same thing. This is what I say in the book. We see a similar propensity of denying the shadow of the figure of light in the mythos of the 12 steps. For the fractured God image, typical of the West, is the same one that Wilson couldn't stomach, and the same one that the vast majority bring into our first 12-step meeting. Faced with the impossible task of relying upon this particular conception to rescue us, whom we can't fully trust, we split the image by swinging violently toward its higher aspect. And just like the church fathers did many centuries ago, we ignore what we imagine to be its dark and destructive side. We see something of Wilson's own misgivings regarding the paradoxical nature of the God image poking through in the wording that he chose for step 3. We made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him. Perhaps without realizing it, Wilson turns away from what he perceived as the morally unreliable aspect of his higher power, and instead focuses on its love and concern, distrusting of the dark, compulsive nature of his own psyche. Wilson makes an unconscious attempt to idealize God's, and thus his own, higher self. Now, again, we could point the finger at Wilson here, but this guy put it all out there when he wrote this book, really demonstrating what self-reflection looks like. And so there's no judgment here. And it's also really important to point out that we are literally standing on the structure that Bill Wilson left us. We're literally standing on his insights to come up with these sort of maybe this more nuanced conception. But Wilson does something that, and this is also very subtle, right? As you look at this from a Jungian perspective, this whole myth of the 12 steps, you're really able to kind of piece together just what makes it so effective. It's not like we're answering the riddle of like, how does spirituality work or something like that? Like, it's still cloaked in mystery. But what we see though is, in the case that I try to make here is we can actually see why Wilson's myth still works, even though he split the God image, just like Nietzsche and Goethe. So, because while he splits the higher power and idealizes its higher aspect, the thing that he does so masterfully, is that he circles back to the primitive, right? He circles back to the archaic, and he delineates the dark and destructive component of the unconscious, right? And so it still works. He it's not, so it's not a fully unconscious portrayal, right? Because there's a certain kind of self-reflection that he gives us where he's saying like, hey, uh, there's this part in me that's really bad, dark, dirty, and will go to any lengths to kill me. And I think that's what helps him to unlock the power. So this is what I say. Our rejection of the Tsar of Heaven is a psychological reaction not unlike Nietzsche's. Rejecting the unpredictable aspect of the deity in favor of something more palatable is in essence killing off the God image, something all of us are guilty of, inasmuch as the Tsar of Heaven is a reflection of our relationship to our own darkness. And yet, it is the psychological nature of Wilson's myth that opened up a path for him that led to wholeness. For as we've seen, he would go on to present the archaic features of the self as a supraordinate psychological entity, characterizing the primitive, Jung's word, as, quote, the sort of thinking that dominates the alcoholic mind, which can only be described as plain insanity. Those are Wilson's words. So why Wilson splits the God image in Bill's story when he rejects the Tsar of Heaven, the fact that he circles back to its archaic form later through the shadow of the anonymous alcoholic allowed him to retain an essential balance of the highest and the lowest of human nature in his myth, and thus to tap into the transformative power of the numinosum. So what Wilson does then is he personifies both aspects of the self. On the one hand, he holds the higher power up, right, as a spiritual ideal. But he also presents the negative aspect of the self as an autonomous psychic complex. And Bill's acceptance of the compulsive nature of the psyche is what allowed him to tap into the transformative power, right? That recognition, right? That once the ego sort of demolishes or drops its delusion of control, that's when the ego then is allowed to tap into this deeper power. And since the symbols are projections of interior psychic states, always, it doesn't matter what we call them or how we envision them, so long as we get to their underlying characteristic. And especially in terms of the dark side, that the most important characteristic that we can really impart to them, in my opinion, or in my understanding, is that they are autonomous psychic complexes, right? So in addition to the alcoholic mind, which we just saw a snippet about, Wilson personifies the primitive aspect of the psyche with other characters as well, characters which we've touched on earlier in the text. And this is what I write. Those characters are the king alcohol, the hideous four horsemen, the boy whistling in the dark, etc. We see masterfully illustrated throughout Wilson's text how religious symbols mirror psychic states, and he guides his readers towards the discovery of the self as it manifests in our lives to the unconscious tendencies that drive us on both sides of the psychospiritual spectrum. To see how Wilson's characterization of the archaic in the Big Book reveals the presence of the paradoxical self requires an exploration of his myth from the same psychological perspective that Jung employed. Assuming Wilson was unaware of Jung's notion of the self, his projection of it shows up right where we would expect it to, as the shadow of the book's archetypal protagonist, that anonymous character that Bill purposely crafted as a psychological mirror for his alcoholic readers. Wilson had become so familiar with aspects of his own darkness that it allowed him to give clear voice to the archaic, personified through various metaphorical characters we encounter in the Big Book, such as the boy whistling in the dark, King Alcohol, and the hideous four horsemen. So really what Wilson's done for us is to elucidate the darkness, right? And to give it, to sort of give it, to personify it in a way. Psychologically speaking, Wilson's own familiarity with his own psyche is what allowed him to sort of objectify the self in this way. And from a psychological perspective, once we're able to personify a complex, right, then what it does is there becomes separation between the complex and the ego. In other words, the ego no longer unconsciously identifies with the complex. It's no longer caught up in the energy of the archetype, right? And it separates itself. And then once there's a separation, then the ego no longer plays God, and there's a more sort of objective perspective of this subjective experience. That's really kind of the nuts and bolts of how these transformations work. Um, this so this formulation then too has allowed me to sort of arrive at a new insight that I kind of was able to pick up over the last 2 or 3 weeks, which is this: that in addition to the beautiful sort of titles that Wilson imparts upon the higher power, like universal mind, spirit of nature, God consciousness, right, all that stuff, we can also see his use of the shadow characters, right? The king alcohol and the hideous four horsemen and the bottle, right? Those are also metaphors for the higher power, in as much as they are sort of the negative aspect of the self. So I think that's just an interesting way to look at this thing from a psychological perspective. So there's another kind of component here that perhaps some of you have caught on to so far, and I didn't introduce it really until this last chapter. But that was that Wilson personified the primitive aspect of the unconscious using the word self, much like Jung had. Now, it's interesting, but AA is one of the only places where the word self is actually kind of demonized, the way we kind of demonize it here, right? Self everywhere else is kind of like the ideal higher self, but in the 12 steps, especially in AA, because of the way Wilson uses the term, we also kind of demonize the self, or imbue it with sort of a darkness. This is what I write. It's easy to overlook the fact that Wilson formulated another far more numinous shadow character than even these, meaning the hideous four horsemen and King Alcohol. And that is that highly abstracted image that he called self, the driving force of the alcoholic mind, unaware that in doing so, he was complementing Jung's conception of that same archetypal image. For, like Jung, Wilson's self illustrates the evil machinations of the universal mind to make conscious contact with the ego, setting the process of self-realization in motion from the unconscious side of the veil. Quote, when we became alcoholics, crushed by a self-imposed crisis that we could neither postpone nor evade, we had to fearlessly face the proposition that God is either everything or else he is nothing. God either is or he isn't. What was our choice to be? Now, the reason I find this so impactful is because when I was studying for this book and writing this book, I didn't really understand Jung's use of the term self until one day I was sitting outside of a diner like we always do. And one of my friends, probably the same guy you've heard me talk about before, was telling me about another one of his romantic conquests, and how this particular conquest had ended in his divorce, because he ran off with a girl half his age, and his wife, his own age, didn't like that too much, so they ended up splitting up. And this was a couple years after this had happened, and he was telling me about that, or telling a group of us about it. And in order to describe the experience, he quoted this passage from Bill Wilson. He says that he was crushed by he called it a self-imposed crisis that he could neither postpone nor evade. And that is exactly the way we've seen Jung talk about self, in terms of driving, driving a sailboat, or driving the ego like the wind drives a sail, right into destruction, violently and recklessly, right? These are the ways that this unconscious complex functions in our lives. And so really it was Bill Wilson, right? His use of the word self that kind of unlocked this insight for me in terms of Jung's self. And this is another example of Wilson's personification of the self in a pretty, famous passage. He says, selfishness, self-centeredness, that we think is the root of our troubles. Driven by 100 forms of fear, self-delusion, self-seeking, and self-pity, we step on the toes of our fellows and they retaliate. Sometimes they hurt us, seemingly without provocation, but we invariably find that at some time in the past we have made decisions based on self, which later placed us in a position to be hurt. So our troubles, we think, are basically of our own making. They arise out of the self. And the alcoholic is an extreme example of self-will run riot, though he usually doesn't think so. Above everything, we alcoholics must be rid of this selfish. We must, or it kills us. God makes that possible. And there often seems no way of entirely getting rid of self without his aid. Many of us had moral and philosophical convictions galore, but we could not live up to them, even though we would have liked to. Neither could we reduce our self-centeredness much by wishing or trying on our own power. We had to have God's help. And, you know, this for me, more recently has become, I think, for me, one of the sort of staples of Wilson's insight and of his own writing. You know, barely sober, no sponsor, no therapist, attending some wacky kind of first century Christian Oxford group meetings, which by the way, he quit attending pretty much right when he started writing the big book, but sort of just this guy with no real direction seemingly arrives at this profound insight about the nature of the human psyche. So much so that he's able to articulate it to where now kings and judges and attorneys and priests, are reading this saying, wow, this is me. It's just such a testament to a guy, to the power, right, of that really determined self-seeking. And Wilson is such a good example of that. The self can show us so much about ourselves if we're just open to it. And I think that that's something that I've really tried to get across in these seminars. Here's my commentary on Wilson's use of the word self. So this is what I write. The we Wilson refers to is the anonymous alcoholic, that modern mythical character reflective of the alcoholic ego. And by employing his use of the word self as a reference to the same archetypal self that Jung discovered, the inner empirical deity, the dynamic between these two psychological entities is illustrated perfectly. The ego is forced to endure the violence done by the self through a multitude of self-imposed crises that it, the ego, does not create and cannot avoid. Jung explained that such crises confront us in situations where there are insoluble conflicts. This means, in other words, that the ego is a suffering bystander who decides nothing but must admit to a decision and surrender unconditionally. What the Wilsonian myth helps to clarify is that humans will find no relief from any of our great obsessions until we surrender to the archaic in our own psyche, conceding that it is far more powerful than our most sincere desires to behave in any certain way. In Alcoholics Anonymous, the primitive, instinctual aspect of the power greater than is what Wilson called self, a personification of his own darkness. And so, just as we've seen this problematic relationship between the ego and the self laid out in ancient myth, where the God image is an indication of the collective unconscious, and where the human characters are a representation of the ego, we see the same exact thing pretty much playing out in the 12 steps and in Wilson's sort of myth, right? And so this goes to show that and this is one reason I would postulate why the 12 steps are such an effective method, is because of this very fact, that Wilson was self-aware enough to project this stuff into his book, and that now we can come along and just all sort of follow suit. And he's giving us a framework for understanding the nature of the objective psyche. This means that just like the Gnostics, the alchemists, Goethe, Nietzsche, and countless others, Wilson projected the self or the process of individuation as he was experiencing it. That goes back to the thing that the 12 steps, Wilson didn't invent the 12 steps. He didn't formulate the 12 steps from other steps, as that's according to William Schaberg's really important research, right? But that Bill sort of sat down on a bad day and busted out the 12 step and was like, wow, there's 12. Holy cow. That they really emerged from the depths of his soul. Recognizing Wilson's projection of the self allows us to go deeper in our own understanding of the dark, hidden reaches of our individual psyche and to plug into the spiritual potential stored there. On the surface, the journey of the 12 steps looks to be about finding a safe passage through the dilemma defined by the opposites, to drink or not to drink. A worthy and necessary spiritual endeavor for those who find it to be an impossible dilemma. However, by providing us an easy-to-read roadmap into the archaic aspect of the psyche, Wilson shows us how to wed our unconscious compulsion to consciousness, propelling us toward greater self-realization long after the drinking problem has dissipated. Beyond to drink and not to drink, humankind is awash in any number of insoluble psychic conflicts that are central to the mythos of the anonymous alcoholic: instinct and spirit, good and evil, selfish and selfless behavior, among countless others, all providing a potential passageway into improved conscious contact with the unconscious self. The task before us, then, is to continue the search for where the archaic manifests in our lives and to wed it to consciousness as best we can. And, this is the benefit of examining this symbol set through the perspective that Jung has given us, right? Again, we can do this with all kinds of philosophies. That's what the Jungians do. Edinger, especially, he'll choose like a group of philosophers and then look at their writings through sort of this perspective of depth psychology. And what is projected almost always is the self. And that's exactly what we're seeing here in the 12 steps. Now, this is where I also sort of bring back up maybe some criticism. It's not meant to be a judgment. It's just a statement of fact, right? This is where we are. This is where we're going next. And this is what I say. As close as William Wilson was to the eternal fountainhead, and this sort of just a conclusion, really, it appears that his own conception of the God image never made that final leap as Jung did when he recapitulated the dichotomous facets of the primordial experience into a single paradoxical unity he called the self. As far as I know, Wilson never equated the power of step 2, the higher power, with sort of the undermining power that we discover in step 1. He did say bottles were a symbol, and by all means, in my mind, bottles are a symbol of the God image. They are a symbol of the self. I fully stand behind this statement, yet I wouldn't even call it a criticism, right? Wilson is beyond reproach in my mind. But that's not to say but the criticism then is upon us, right? Where are we at in this process? Where are we at in our own quest for more self-reflection and self-discovery? The big book presents a snapshot of Wilson's psychology when he wrote it. And perhaps something of the collective psychology of his inner circle, right? Dr. Bob gave him some feedback. Hank Parkhurst gave him some feedback. I think Ruth was given some feedback. Frank Amos was giving some feedback. But he had some things to pull from, but it's not a harmful question for us to consider, what stage of the conjunctio had Wilson arrived at, right? Because following on the heels of that question is the question for us: what stage of the conjunctio have we arrived at? Where can the 12 steps get me to where I need to go? Where is my program in the 12 steps lacking? Right? What is there to do for me? What am I reluctant to do? What am I not looking at? Right? That most important question, right? What about me am I still unable to see? And I keep getting some really good insights from Jung, or not from Jung, from Ming. So the one thing I want to say this too, just to kind of revisit, right? This sounds really strange, but it makes sense to me now, right? If our conception of God is in fact changing, right? If say even over the course of these 20 some odd weeks, your conception of God has gone from this to this, then what that tells you is that there are changes taking place in the background of your psyche, and that your projection of this God image into the world is indicative of those changes being made. That's the great insight that Jung gives us into these symbols. Dreams work the same way, right? But our expression of the symbols, our experience of these symbols, is the evidence we have of what's taking place in our lives. So that, you know, God as we understood him, or God as we understand him, is thus a measuring rod, right? By which we can tell just how fully we are in acceptance of the great reality, right? And that the more human our God image is, perhaps the more whole or complete we are as individual human beings. This is what Jung tells us about having such a conception of this paradoxical image. He says, like all archetypes, the self has a paradoxical antinomial character. It is male and female, old man and child, powerful and helpless, large and small. The self is a true complexio oppositorum, though this does not mean that it is anything like as contradictory in itself. It is quite possible that the seeming paradox is nothing but a reflection of the enantiodromian changes of the conscious attitude, which can have a favorable or unfavorable effect on the whole. And that reminds me of Jung's own conception, right? Where God is the name by which he designates everything that cascades into his life, that changes the course of his little plans and designs. And I know I hacked the quote, but hopefully you get the point. The self represents a union of opposites. It can also appear as a united duality in the form, for instance, of Tao as the interplay of yang and yin, or of the hostile brothers, or of the hero and his adversary, arch enemy, dragon, etc. Empirically, therefore, the self appears as a play of light and shadow, although conceived as a totality, a unity in which the opposites are united. And so so that really gets to the sort of the meaning of the title, right? When we're speaking of the shadow of a figure of light, we are speaking of the self, right? And that while I may at one point have thought that was a reflection of the God image, right? The shadow of the God image. It's actually a commentary on my own state of being and my own spiritual progress. So, and we're wrapping up here. I've got a few more slides, and I'm just going to blast through these. So, I mean, we're still good on time. So this is another, so we've encountered this image throughout. So this may sound confusing, right? We're talking about this paradoxical image, right? And this, I take a few paragraphs in the end of this to kind of describe why it's a paradox and what that means. This is what it says. Personifying the dynamic that permeates the cosmos, the self is a field of energy projected into a form that the human ego can relate to, epitomized by the dichotomous anthropomorphic symbols we've explored, the God image, the trickster, and the alcoholic. The self may appear as a paradoxical play on any commonly held pair of opposites, man, woman, old, young, light, dark, powerful, powerless, as well as wounded healer and sober drunk. The paradoxical nature of such symbols is meant to be problematic for the ego, sharpening awareness of whatever insoluble dilemma that the unconscious has used to snare it. Remember, the experience of the self is always a defeat for the ego. Edinger writes that paradox is an affront to the logic of consciousness, so it's a deliberate defeat for the rational ego. Paradoxes always point to the self. Every spiritual tale, even our own, is composed of qualities that are impossible for us to reconcile. Such paradoxes become an important instrument the self deploys in our quest for enlightenment. Paradox does more justice to the unknowable than clarity can do, explains Jung. For uniformity of meaning robs the mystery of its darkness and sets it up as something that is known. And then this is my commentary on that. When the mystery, capital M, is robbed of its darkness, it loses the transformative power it might have otherwise evoked. And, you know, the thing that occurs to me right now in this moment is that while it looks like we've spent 20 some odd weeks trying to unravel this mystery, in the end, the only thing that's happened for me, at least, is that the nature of this, the darkness of this mystery has increased maybe tenfold, right? It's like the more we get into this, the deeper and the darker it gets. There's a line that Jung often quoted from Tertullian, which I love, and I'm going to quote it here. It says, it's regarding paradox. He says, "And the Son of God is dead, which is worthy of belief because it is absurd. And when buried, he rose again, which is certain because it is impossible." And I love that, right? Because it really kind of points to the nature of recovery, right? That we want to talk about, oh yeah, I'm willing to do the steps, and therefore, having had a spiritual awakening. But really, there's a mystery that underlines that sort of underlies this entire thing that none of us really know anything about. This is what I write about the archetype of the alcoholic. So, and I want to just comment on this, right? Because we've seen maybe that Wilson sort of in his own conception, if you will, and it not like it matters that much, but if we were to offer criticism, that the shortcomings of Wilson's conception didn't really affect the effectivity, I guess, affectivity of his myth, right? Because of the nature of this dualistic thing that he presents, right? The higher power and the lower power. But I make this point in the book, which I think is quite an interesting postulate. And I'll just read. Thus, the 12 steps, even with its inadequate conception of God, has proven to be adequate enough to save millions because it is accompanied by that paradoxical image of wholeness, the archetype of the alcoholic, whose transformative power we experience consciously for the first time when we finally utter out loud words that spark an immediate expansion of spiritual consciousness. I am an alcoholic. As Stephen Herman explains, unconsciously identifying with any archetype of the transpersonal psyche can be dangerous psychologically. Being conscious of one's shadow is perhaps a more modest way to achieve a wider consciousness of the wholeness of the personality. For alcoholics and drug addicts, modesty was never written into our DNA. But the minute we concede to our innermost selves that we are powerless, we consciously disidentify with the archaic aspect of the archetype, putting a halt to the havoc it has been wreaking in our lives. In that moment, we also make a significant part of the shadow conscious, thereby lighting upon the path to self-realization. Thus, and I love this statement right here, the archetype of the alcoholic, personifying the dualistic energy of the collective unconscious, evokes transformative power in our lives long before we ever come to believe that a figure of light will do it. And, I've always wondered about this, the great question of how is it possible that atheists can use a spiritual program and get sober? And I think that the archetype of the alcoholic provides an answer to that question. Because what actually changes us is this symbol of the alcoholic, right? And when we say I'm an alcoholic, again, we sort of remove ourselves from that we consciously disidentify, right? We disidentify with the self, and then we can begin to sort of even then the alcoholic goes through its own transformation, right? And becomes the grateful alcoholic. So this sort of underlying paradox of the 12 steps is I think perhaps another one of the reasons why the steps work so well. And then we've seen this quote from Ettinger before, and this is where he talks about these complexities and sort of seeing them from an archetypal perspective, and then that kind of rounds this out. We first experience compulsion through the shadow, but after a lengthy period of analyzing our complexities, hopefully then we get to their core, which is an archetype. The archetypal energy, the fire that's at the root of the complexities, derives from the self. Then we begin to experience compulsion, what sets us on fire, not as a product of our complexities because we've disidentified with them, right? But we experience them as an expression of the self. Here, the important idea is that the compulsive dynamism of all complexities derives from the self. When you see that, then you don't have a complex anymore, which does not mean, however, that you aren't subject to inflammable effects, not at all. But it does mean that you're experiencing them on a different level, and they become part of an ongoing dialogue with the self. Before one sees that such things derive from the self, one is in constant danger of being possessed by a complex. In other words, of catching on fire from the inflammability of the complex. Well, that's my elaboration, says Ettinger, of Jung's succinct remark, compulsion has two sources, the shadow and the self. And, you know, once, again, it's the archetype of the alcoholic that creates that spiritual power for us. And the self uses the archetype of the alcoholic to lead us towards awakening. And I've got two more slides. This is the second to last paragraph in the book. It says, the transformative power of the self is only made apparent in the midst of the most profound paradoxes, such as the alcoholic embodies. Similar antinomies are woven throughout the steps. Among them, the oft-used phrase, sober alcoholic, is probably the most apparent, closely followed by grateful alcoholic, indicative of one's connection to the antithetical energy embodied by the archetype of the alcoholic. Overall, 12-step experience confirms Jung's statement that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And while the vast majority of us tend to idealize the higher self, leaving only our good side within view, we might endeavor to explore the dark side of our personality as well, to uncover for ourselves what role the shadow plays in our quest for expanding consciousness. Evidencing how powerful such an approach is are decades of the most glaring kind of selfish and self-centered behavior, giving way to the plethora of authentic spiritual awakenings, such as we see wholesale in the 12-step fellowships, answering how it comes to be that utterly selfish and self-centered people like us can get set on the path of enlightenment, notwithstanding all the damage wrought to our personal relationships and communities. Very often one hears in a meeting, I'm glad I didn't get what I deserved. Many who are far more worthy won't ever make it to the rooms, let alone uncover the mysteries of the great reality and unleash the creative powers of the universe. There's a quote that Jung often used. It says, no tree can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. And this is the last paragraph of the book, sort of a conclusion of everything, hopefully. It says, the path of enlightenment diverges from where we initially expected it to go, cutting right through the middle of the most depraved parts of ourselves. In the words of the Greek philosopher Heraclitus, it is the opposite which is good for us. The way up and the way down are the same. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and end it. And with one more brief reminder, to please, if you wouldn't mind, jumping onto Amazon and Goodreads and giving me just, like they say on YouTube, hit like and subscribe or whatever. So don't do that. But if you can, jump onto Amazon, I'd love it. So I'll stop sharing and I will turn it back over to Duncan.
Thank you, Cody. I've made it possible for everyone to unmute and express our collective sounds of
Thank you, Cody, for your
appreciation.
contribution.
Thank you.
Cody.
Thank you so much.
Hey. Great job.
Awesome, Cody.
What a
Thank you,
ride.
Cody.
Thank you, Cody. Thank you, Duncan and Cody.
What a wonderful.
And Ming.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Ming Yung Ming.
Thanks, everybody. Okay, we're going to go to our Q&A session. And remember, we're still recording. And if you don't want your voice recorded, you can post your question in the chat. You can address it to me, and I will weave those questions into the Q&A session along with folks who have their hand raised. If you'd like to ask a question, you can raise your virtual hand, and along with Cody's invitation to go to Amazon, Ming, will you put that link in the chat again, please? Because I want the opportunity to do that, and I know it's further back, but some people have joined after and so on. Thank you. I see that. Dave, come on in. Oh, and remember, folks, we're giving 90 full seconds to ask your question, but if you can ask it quicker than that, then that's fine. Please ask a question. It's not a time for shares. Come on in, Dave.
Cool. Thanks so much, Duncan. Thanks so much, Cody. Two, really. One is, can you do that in half an hour? And by that, I mean not the entire story, but do you have a 30-minute presentation of that to get people to even start thinking about what you do in the book and then to possibly explore further? Is that available? And the second thing I want to ask is, if you want to share, what kind of personal growth did you experience through the research as well as the writing of this book? Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dave. I really appreciate the questions, and I do also appreciate your help with timing and showing up. So thank you for that. To answer the first question, so it's hard, I mean, I think I have a 45-minute or a 1-hour presentation on my website that is sort of an introduction to the history part of the book, the first 4 chapters. And then I have another, 45-minute or 1-hour presentation on the archetype of the alcoholic, which is also a pretty good introduction to some Jungian concepts and whatnot. But it's really hard to cram in this much information. So if I were to give a 30-minute presentation, I would have to really be picky about what I can include. There's a reason that I remember early on, reading with Ming, and finally getting down to these chapters, and then go and she was kind enough to read with me and provide really good, helpful feedback, which I never liked. But the criticism was very often, and I got this from more than one source. It was like, all the good stuff's in the back of the book. And I think that's probably true, but there's no way to get to the good stuff without the foundation of all the other stuff, I don't think, because Jung's perspective and method is just so robust that it's not something you can just dive into, midway and really appreciate. So, I think at this point now, I'm using terms and phrases and sort of, I'm saying things that I would have never dreamt of saying in the first couple of weeks, right? And that, but we've built up to this so we can sort of discuss these things in a more free way. And what's crazy to me about it is it just keeps going and going. There's no, you never run up to the end where you're like, oh, I guess I have figured it all out now at this point. To answer your question about what I learned through writing the book, I didn't even know what I was going to write about when I started writing. And I basically wrote 2 books, because I wrote the first version, and I started working with Dr. Herman, and I had him, he was helping and he was mentoring me. And what happened was, he then gave me the story about Jaime and everything in the beginning. So I rewrote I just wrote those chapters. They didn't exist before. And then I had to piece those chapters with sort of what's in the back of the book. So what ended up surviving was really only the last sort of 6 or 7 chapters, but then that middle section is all brand new. So, you know, but so basically everything that's in the book I learned when I was writing the book. I guess that would be the best way to say that. So you know, and what's even more fascinating to me is that since I've written the book, I've had as equally a profound awakening by doing the dream work and reading alchemy. So this book represents a journey into the shadow, and it looks at the objective psyche or the collective unconscious, how the unconscious manifests through these complexes, right? So this is the way that the psyche will sort of move us through compulsion, through behavior, through you know, the stuff we talked about in the 12 steps, right? But there's a whole other kind of side to it that I've discovered since the book was published, which is the way the psyche will manifest through dreams and through active imagination, which is as equally profound and moving. So that's, you know, that's what I'm going to talk about over the next few weeks, and probably end up writing another book on. So, because it sort of is a continuation of this process that we've just kind of wrapped up. So, thank you, Dave.
Thank you. Question from the chat. In the East, we have a caste system in India to divide the beautiful and pure from the unclean. Is this a practice deriving from a religious idea of divine good and evil?
That's a great question. And it's actually a thing that Ming and I were talking about literally last night. You know, and I don't know enough about Eastern religion to comment directly. I don't think so, though. Because the reason I say that is because it seems to me that in the East, there's a better understanding of the dualistic nature of the God image, right? So there's feminine deities, and there's, you know, like the yin and yang is an Eastern symbol. So they seem to have given place for the two sides of the equation, whereas in the West, our tendency has been to deny the dark half. Meanwhile, we're creating tons of darkness for the rest of the world because we're unwilling to look at our own shadow. So I don't know that the caste system grows out of that. However, I think it is safe to say that in terms of religion and sort of men's use of religious symbols in order to subjugate people and to you know, maintain power, I think that it is a convenient, you know, system in order to keep the power structure intact. So if I was going to look at it critically, that would be, I think, my perspective of what's wrong with it. But that would be probably as much as I would be able to say at this point.
Thank you. We'll go to Diane C. Come on in.
I apologize. I got to stay off camera because I have wobbly internet with video, etc. So I'll try to make this quick also. So as I was following you, Cody, which has been amazing, thank you for presenting this, and for Berlin Group also, etc., and all of you people here. But as I was following this, I was trying to connect my thoughts with something that you shared, and if you can just elaborate a little bit. So it was the self, and then what I put, the self is the gift of desperation, the surrender. And then when you talked about the ego has to submit, stand by, is that the process that the self is the, I don't know how I can say this, is the gift of desperation? That's when the self occurs, and then this ego has to submit, has to stand by and watch the gift of desperation evolve. How we get sober. I don't know. I'm trying to put it all together, Cody. So could you just help me out with that? Because I made a connection somewhere in that.
Yes, absolutely. It sounds like you're kind of hot on the heels of self-realization. Yeah. So for me, so I make a big deal about the dark side of the self. And I think I do that out of sort of just a response to my own upbringing. I grew up in Southern Utah. There's a big Mormon community. Like I'm like kind of with Wilson, where he sort of casts judgment upon some of those righteous people we know. So and even still, like I I just love the darkness, and I'm kind of a worshiper of the darkness. So I emphasize the dark character of the self. So the Jung says that the ego becomes a suffering bystander, and this is very important, right, in terms of understanding our own psychology, because the ego is that part of us that is essentially almost, you could say, neutral. It's more of like an innocent child than it is sort of something that we should demonize. The ego is this conscious entity that has grown up in a dangerous environment. And part of the danger that is presented to the ego comes from the background of the psyche, its own self. The very thing that spawned the ego, right? And that the self will railroad the ego into any number of insoluble psychological dilemmas in order to make it wake up from its delusion of being in control. So, and that's why alcoholism is a great sort of symbol, I guess, of this process, because we talk about in AA or NA or just any of these programs, how we suffer from a delusion of control, that if we could just manage and control, everything would be fine, right? And so the self is really going to do everything it can in order to wake the ego up out of that delusion. And that only happens through ego death or through pain. Once that shift has occurred, then the ego kind of moves into this category that we call step 3, where it makes a decision, really a forced decision, that is going to turn itself over to the care of this higher power. We call it God. It's God is an image of the self, right? It's a reflection of the self. So, but once that shift has occurred, then the ego realigns its relationship to this supraordinate entity, this empirical God image. And at that point, then the self becomes helpful, right? The self begins to open doors and to reveal sort of, different insights. So, and it's still, and this is where the concept of vocation comes in, is that there's still a compulsive element behind the self once you've kind of crossed the threshold. But the compulsion now looks more like religious devotion than it did alcohol degeneracy, if that makes sense. So we're sort of trapped between this thing, the self, right? Like it's almost like a pendulum. In the early stages of our egoic individuation, our psychological development, we're sort of swinging back and forth between these two poles, right? The higher and the lower, the good and the bad, the sober and the drunk. And that the self does this in order to really, because it has to dismantle the ego's delusion of control. So that's how I would answer that question. I think it's a phenomenal question. So, and we've talked a lot about this in previous sessions too. So yes, thank you so much.
Thank you. Another question from the chat. Bill Wilson's benders were hard to imagine in their scale. For example, he and a friend took a plane and flew somewhere for a few days. Difficult to imagine the lack of intervention, law enforcement intervention in those times where white men in the US were free to indulge their desires and return home repentant but clueless of what they had done. Do you think Bill suffered a real terror that he might have done terrible harm to others while on those day-long sprees?
You know, I mean, I think it's a valid question. Um, you know, it is, you know, it's also interesting, I think, that I mean, that, you know, I mean, Bill was, I mean, he was, his big goal, like in those early days of sobriety, was to get the audience of Henry Ford, because he was looking for somebody to give him money to start this big chain of hospitals. And there was, you know, there was a darn good chance that I mean, he damn near pulled it off. He did meet with the Rockefeller people, you know, so he was only steps away from the most powerful people in the world. So certainly there's some privilege there, right, that plays into his story. And so this is what I think is my commentary on the question, is that, you know, the self, regardless of somebody's sort of sociological or societal like position or whatever, is still working to dismantle those prejudices, and that nobody's safe, right? Bill at one point was a multimillionaire, so, you know, by today's standards, he was like, you know, a big fat cat on Wall Street, and yet he, you know, he still just the self still destroyed his life. You know, he says we you know, our troubles are of our own making. And that insight is a phenomenal insight, especially in terms of you know, a rich white guy that probably could have gotten away without looking too deeply into the mirror for a few more years until he finally went the way of all the world. So I think it's an interesting question and probably worth some discussion. So thank you.
Thank you, Patrick in Cologne.
Thank you. Thank you, Duncan. Thank you, Cody. Thank you, everybody who's on this call. Yeah, so I'm kind of, that was a lot. So I'm kind of digesting. But I think I recognize something new, and that is, you know, in neoliberal capitalism, there's often the criticism that when things go wrong, the losses are collectivized, and then when the trouble is over, the profits are privatized again. And from a psychological perspective, what I've seen is that the light is collectivized and seen as something as part of the collective unconscious, but the darkness is privatized and is not seen as part of the collective unconscious. I think that is something that's changing with me right now. So anything that I would view as being outside of the archetype is an illusion. That is self-will run riot. And the moment I can bring it all together, you know, that the prayer says, make me an instrument of thy peace, but that doesn't mean that we cannot be the instrument of destruction and darkness. But I jump to that conclusion. One way or another, I'm an instrument. Where my free will comes in is that I can get to choose. Once I see this, I can get to choose which quality of energy I channel. Does that make any sense to you, Cody?
It does, actually. It does. You know, I think just a couple of weeks ago, we read a slide that was, you know, Edinger had said something pretty similar, that we don't create ourselves and we don't create the complex, right? That there's an invader that comes and causes this in us. However, we are responsible to take ownership and accountability for its existence, right? And you know, I was talking to a newcomer last week, and she was saying that she was going to make amends to her family, but they were quite abusive towards her. You know, and you know, and she has a sponsor and stuff, and my response was, you know, well, you make that amends, right? like you can be mad later on, you know, that anger probably is in there somewhere, but that for now we're taking responsibility, right? Um, and I think I think it's an interesting exercise. Um, you know, Jung would talk about this identification, right? That the ego tends to identify with either this or that, and it becomes this unconscious identification. So I think that the warning might be that we want to be careful that we don't unconsciously identify with the light while consciously, you know, disidentifying with the darkness, right? That because the self, you know, at the end of the day is a big trickster, and it's almost like it's just going to trip us up in any arena that it can. And so we want to try to stay vigilant for getting too carried away, you know. So, and which is certainly my problem. I love to you know, fly away into the light. Um, lately I've been having dreams. The other day I had a dream of I was in Europe, and a gang had come and taken over the city, and suddenly all the jets that were flying around the city were blowing up and falling out of the earth, falling out of the sky onto the earth, which I took as a commentary on my psyche. Like I needed to come down out of the clouds and get grounded, which is what's happening. So yeah, I like what you say too about the collectivization of the darkness, or was it the other one? The privatization of the darkness and the collectivization of the light. That seems like pretty insightful, because as we see, so the things that happen to us individually are pretty it's pretty easy to see them on a collective scale, whether historically or just within our own communities or wherever. So it's really interesting the way archetypes are layered like that. They're kind of fractals. So
Thank you.
thanks, Patrick.
Thank you. Question from the chat. In the mystery of the self, do you have any thoughts about divine intervention? The avatars, prophets, did they come out of the world, or were they born into the world?
I mean, that's an interesting question. If I don't quite understand the phrasing, you know, did they come out of the world or were they born into the world? I think there's a lot to say there. But I might not be the guy that can say much about it. Like I can imagine like what Edinger might do with this question, and I'm unfortunately not there. I think that what I find, so I was talking to a guy the other day, and we were talking about Saint Paul. So who was at one point who was Saul of Tarsus, and Saul was sort of he was an abuser of his power. You know, he participated in the martyrdom of Christians. And Jung says that, you know, had there been divine intervention on Saul's path towards Tarsus, he may not have become Paul, right? Who by some accounts is sort of the founder of Christianity. And it's not that like if Paul would have got hungry like the day before he got there, like he would have pulled in and maybe missed the angel, right? The message is that had Paul not committed all those violent acts on the way to his awakening, then he may not have become the same sort of prophet that he was in his conversion. That's not I mean, we can look at that as a myth, you know, safely. Whether it's historically accurate or not, that's not what I'm commenting on. But that the, you know, mythologically speaking, right, that we tend to if you know, we want to kill everything that we're not familiar with, right, and that we don't understand, even the things that are good for us and the things that later on we're going to accept. We want to do everything to get away from those things, you know, just no, until suddenly the self just kind of boom, like, here I am, what are you going to do now? You know, like I'm the one you're persecuting, what are you doing? So I think that's kind of, you know, to whether certain individuals are born into the world or whether they grow out of the world, I would say that in the realm of the human, we grow out of the world. You know, there may have been a few who were born into it, like Jesus or the Buddha, or but most of us are born out of it. So.
So, how do we honestly turn our will and our lives over to the care of what has become an unreliable self?
I love this question. I mean, that is the question, right? And you know, this is why I don't know that we make the decision. I wonder if we're coerced into making the decision. Because I know for me personally, like I thought I made the decision 100 times, right? And then it feels like at the end the decision was made for me. That my ego was incapable of really making that decision. And that's an interesting twist, I think, because Jung talks a lot about strengthening the ego. And it occurs to me now that it appears that a lot of the ego strength comes in its resistance to the self. That's what even helps to make it a little stronger and a little stronger. And so, but which is a good thing, right? Once the ego collapses and then kind of makes the turn into the self or whatever, that ego strength becomes a real kind of, it becomes helpful and powerful. And the ego needs that strength in order to basically withstand the arrows that the self is shooting at it. So, but to go back to the question, I don't know that I'm not sure. For me personally, I guess I can just say that I don't know that I was the one that made the decision. Notwithstanding the unreliability of the self, I still don't know that I was the one that made the decision. So yeah, it's a very thoughtful question. You're muted, Patrick or Philip.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I don't want it to end, but here we are. We've got no more hands and no more questions in the chat. We're 11 minutes past the hour. And well, I'd just like to say how amazing this has been. I've been here 20 some weeks. This has been really good for me. Really want to thank you, Cody and Ming, for inviting me to be your host. Really appreciate it, and hope to continue in service with you guys, exploring other things. Happy to be part of the team here. Thank you, everybody, so much for being part of this. The recordings are all available on Cody's website at cody-peterson.com. The book's available at cody-peterson.com. Please go to Amazon if you're inclined and leave a positive reflection about your experience here or with the book if you have a chance. We'll continue next Tuesday with the next program from Cody. That's cool. I'm glad we'll have 4 more weeks of something to do. And then we're thinking of more things we can do, because maybe we can keep this Tuesday channel going on other things. I've got some ideas. Cody's got ideas. We may be able to keep going here on Tuesdays. So let's see. Let me move.